Alright, so if you've watched any of my sewing videos before, I'm sure that you know that the first step is always going to be to wash and dry your fabric and iron it to get out all of those wrinkles. Alright, so I'm just getting all of these wrinkles out so that my fabric is nice and neat for when I'm going to start cutting. And I'm going to go ahead and just double the fabric over and lay it on top of my work surface. Most of the time with patterns, you usually end up cutting on a fold. That way the two sides are exactly symmetrical. So I'm cutting the skirt piece here, and I want it to be 22 inches long and 44 inches wide. So I'm just making a 22-inch mark down from each corner and connecting those two marks, and I'm just going to draw a line just to make it a lot easier to cut. Now, for the size that I made this apron, I actually did not even need to cut the width because my fabric was 44 inches wide. So I'm just going to cut that length, and my skirt piece is already cut. Alright, moving on to the bodice. I'm going to go ahead and just redouble over my fabric to the size that I need, just so that I'm not cutting my bodice piece right out of the middle. And I'm going to make my bodice 11 inches long, so I'm going to go ahead and make that mark. And for the width of the bodice, I want the bottom to be slightly wider than the top, so I'm going to make a 6-inch mark at the top and a 7-inch mark at the bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and draw my lines just so it's easy to cut. I'm just connecting that top line with that bottom line. It's going to make a nice, neat diagonal line for me to cut. I also did just want to mention that these measurements are completely customizable. You can lengthen the skirt if you want to by changing that 22-inch measurement or shorten it, either way. Same thing with the width of the skirt, you can shorten it or lengthen it. With the bodice, if you want to lengthen or shorten the torso, go ahead and just change that 11-inch measurement, and with the top width and the bottom width, that's completely customizable as well. Just remember to make the top of the bodice a little bit smaller than the bottom of the bodice, just to give it a little bit of shape. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to cutting the neck and waistband ties. I'm just using a 1-inch wide cotton ribbon, and I'm going to be cutting two lengths that are 21 inches, and those are going to be the neckties. And then I'm going to cut one longer one that's 55 inches, and that's going to be the waistband. Okay, so now that everything is cut out, we are going to head over to our ironing board again, and we're going to start ironing down the seams, or the outside edges of the bodice and the skirt. So I'm going to start with the bodice, and I'm going to be turning over the sides first. I'm going to turn over a 1/2 inch and then another 1/2 inch so that I don't have any raw edges exposed. Like I said, I'm going to do that on the two sides first, and then I'm going to go ahead and do the top of the bodice. For now, we're going to be leaving the bottom of the bodice open. We're not going to be doing anything to the bottom quite yet. As you can see here, it's always a good idea to go ahead and just pin everything in place so that it's nice and neat for when you head over to your sewing machine. Okay, so the bodice is done for now, and now we're going to move on to the skirt piece. We're going to be doing basically the same thing. We're going to turn over the sides first, just that 1/2 inch and then another 1/2 inch over so that everything is nice and neat and there's no raw edges exposed. And we're going to do that on each side of the skirt and then the bottom of the skirt. So remember, on the bodice, we left the bottom of it without turning any seams over. It's going to be the opposite on the skirt. We're going to leave the top without turning any seams over. So go ahead and get all of those seams finished and ironed over. And just like with the bodice, be sure to pin everything in place so that it's all nice and neat and ready to go for when we head over to the machine. Alright, but before we start sewing, we do need to jump back over to our bodice here for just a minute and go ahead and get these neck tie straps in place. Now to do this, you're going to want to lift up the second fold of the top edge that we ironed over, and you're going to place one of the tie straps almost to the edge of the bodice. The tie strap should be hanging down towards the bottom right now. Then you're going to lay the second iron fold down over the tie strap so that the raw edge isn't exposed anymore, and you're going to lift the tie strap up towards the top and just pin it in place. I hope you can kind of see what I'm doing here. Okay, so everything is now pinned in place and ready to go, so we're going to start sewing. We're going to go ahead and begin with the skirt. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just sew all 3 sides of the skirt in one seam. Now you could do each side as a separate seam and just backstitch at the end of each, or you can do it just how I'm doing it right here. This is honestly really simple if you just do it as one continual seam and just go ahead and turn it at the corners like you just saw me doing there. Okay, so now that you've finished all 3 sides of the skirt, we're going to go ahead and move on to the bodice. We're doing basically the same thing here. I'm just going to go ahead and do this all as one seam again, just turning at the corners. Now when you get to the top where you have the neck tie straps in place, this is probably one of the trickiest parts just because that's a lot of bulk for your machine to go through. Honestly, sometimes when I'm going through a bulky section like that, I actually just turn the needle manually just to get through that little bit. But once you're out of that bulky area, it's just as simple as the skirt. So just turn it right there at the corner, continue along the top, and then you'll just have one more bulky section right there where the other neck tie strap is. Alright, now there's just one last thing that we're going to do to finish off this bodice section, and that's going to be to finish the edges of the neck tie straps. So we're just going to turn over about a 1/2 inch and then one more 1/2 inch just to enclose those raw edges, and you're just going to make a really short seam along that ribbon. Now, kind of like the tie strap area on the bodice, this can be a little bulky and a little hard for your machine to get through. If it seems to really be struggling, you could just tack that down by hand, but you should be able to work that through your machine if you just take your time with it. Alright, now this next step is optional, but I'm going to go ahead and use a serger and go ahead and just serge this raw edge of the skirt. Now, I normally do this with the raw edge of the bodice as well, but honestly I completely forgot, so just the skirt got that this time around. But like I said, it's optional. You could use a serger if you have one, you could do a zigzag stitch on your machine, or you could just let it go entirely, but it does kind of finish off those raw edges even if they are on the underside. Alright, moving on back to our machine, we're going to go ahead and set our machine to a wide stitch because we're going to be gathering the skirt with this stitch. Be sure to not back stitch on either side of this seam because you want to be able to pull that bobbin thread. So go ahead and just make a seam right there close to the edge of your fabric. Now if you did serge or zigzag the edge, be sure not to run into those stitches. But let's go ahead and just make a long seam right across there, and once again, don't back stitch when you get to the end. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and just gather our skirt. So you're going to pull on the bobbin thread on both sides and go ahead and just pull the gather to the center. Go ahead and just pull that until you are satisfied with the gather in the skirt and until it's the width that you want. Now it's finally time to put all of these pieces together and assemble our apron. So to do this, we need to layer the skirt, the bodice, and the waistband all together. So we're just going to lay the skirt down, face up, and then we're going to add the bodice piece face down on top of that. You want to make sure that it's centered. And then finally, on top of that bodice piece, we're going to take that waistband and we're just going to lay that over top of both of those pieces. Once again, go ahead and just make sure that is centered. You want everything to be nice and even and symmetrical here. And once we have all of that in place, we're going to go ahead and just pin all three of those layers together so that we're ready to sew. Alright, so now that that is all pinned in place, you're going to go ahead and just make a seam connecting all three of those pieces together. You're going to want to have just about a 1/4 inch seam allowance away from that edge. So just continue that all the way across. This can be a little bit tricky. This is one of the trickier parts of this project. Just really take your time with this seam and make sure that everything is staying nice and neat before you sew anything, just so you don't end up with any pieces of the skirt bunched up and then you have to rip that seam out. So just really take your time with this part. just going to be adding a couple finishing touches right here at the end. So we're first of all going to be turning the tie strap upward at each edge where it's connected to the sides of the skirt, and we're just going to make a short seam holding the tie and the edge of the skirt upward. This is just going to keep everything looking nice and neat. And then finally, we are just going to go ahead and turn under 2 times the edges of the waistband tie, just like we did the ends of the neckties. And we're just going to go ahead and make a little seam holding all of that in place. Once again, if this seems like a little too much bulk for your machine, you could do this part by hand, but if you just take your time with it, it should be fine. Alright, well that is it for this tutorial. I hope you all enjoyed it. Be sure to head on over to the blog at almostheavenhomesteading.com to get the full written instructions and to see those instructions on how to customize the size if you decided to do so. As usual, thank you so much for watching. I would so appreciate it if you decided to subscribe, and go ahead and comment below if you decide to make your own apron. Alright friends, I'll see y'all later.